Think about the last time you were in a relationship where the other person treated you badly. But you stayed anyway. You knew you should leave. Your friends told you to do so. Even some part of you knew it made no sense. But you stayed. Not because you were weak, not because you were naive, but because something in your brain had been reconfigured, without your knowledge and without your consent. And by the time you understood what had happened, the reconfiguration was already complete. Here is what nobody tells you about that situation. The pull you felt toward that person was not love, at least not in the way the word is normally used. It was addiction. A documented, neurologically verifiable addiction, running on the same brain circuitry as gambling, the same chemistry as cocaine, the same withdrawal arc as opioids. And the mechanism that built it was not their beauty or their charm or any of the things you told yourself at the time. It was a schedule. A pattern of reward and deprivation so specific and so powerful that B.F. Skinner mapped it in the 1950s in a laboratory, and it has been running inside human relationships ever since. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you are not just going to understand what happened. You are going to understand exactly how it was built. And that understanding is going to be both liberating and genuinely uncomfortable. In 1953, B.F. Skinner placed a rat in a box with a lever. When the rat pressed the lever, food appeared. Skinner varied the schedule of reward delivery and documented what happened to the rat's behavior under each schedule. The critical finding was this: when reward arrives on a fixed, predictable schedule, the behavior is stable but extinguishable. Remove the reward and the behavior stops. But when reward arrives on a variable schedule, something completely different happens. The behavior becomes compulsive, frantic, resistant to extinction in a way that is almost impossible to stop from the inside. Skinner called this the partial reinforcement extinction effect. The less predictable the reward, the longer the behavior persists after the reward is removed entirely. The rat kept pressing the lever long after the food stopped coming. Not because the rat was stupid, because its nervous system had been trained to associate the lever with the possibility of reward. And possibility, it turns out, is more motivating than certainty. This is the engine inside every slot machine ever built. It is also the engine inside every relationship where the warmth only arrives sometimes. Unpredictably. Just often enough to keep you reaching for it. We are going to come back to what this means in practice in a moment, but first you need to understand the two phases of the cycle. Because without both phases, the mechanism does not work. And understanding both is what changes everything. The first phase is called love bombing. The term originated in research on cult recruitment tactics in the 1970s and was later adopted by psychologists studying narcissistic abuse patterns. But love bombing is not limited to extreme or obviously manipulative relationships. It is the intense, overwhelming delivery of positive attention in the early stages of connection. Constant contact. The feeling of being completely seen. Declarations of depth that arrive far too early. The sense that you have found something rare. Your brain responds to this the way it responds to any unusually powerful reward. Dopamine floods the system. Your nervous system begins to orient around this person the way a compass orients toward north. And here is the part that makes love bombing dangerous rather than simply flattering. It is not establishing a relationship. It is establishing a baseline. A specific height of warmth and attention that your nervous system now treats as the reference point. And baselines are dangerous because of what happens when they drop. You cannot feel the loss of something you never had. The love bombing creates the attachment that makes the subsequent withdrawal unbearable. It sets the price of the drug before the drug is withheld. And the moment the withdrawal arrives, which it always does, the target is already conditioned to pay whatever price is asked to get back to baseline. This is not an accident of human emotion. It is the architecture of the trap. The withdrawal does not announce itself. It comes as a cooling. A message that is shorter than usual. A quality of distraction in a conversation that was previously fully attentive. And the brain, which has now calibrated its reward system around this person, registers the reduction not as neutral information but as threat. This is where the dynamic locks in. Because the response to perceived threat in the attachment system is not detachment. It is pursuit. The target reaches out more, tries harder, becomes more attentive and more accommodating. They scan every interaction for information about what changed and how to change it back. And then, unpredictably, the warmth returns. And here is the moment that determines everything about what comes next. The return of warmth is not because the target did anything specific to earn it. It is on a variable schedule. And the brain, which has been pressing the lever frantically in the dark, receives the pellet. The relief is enormous. And the lesson the nervous system draws is not that this person is unsafe. The lesson the nervous system draws is that persistence works. Keep going. Keep reaching. The warmth is coming. It will be worth it. The next cycle begins immediately. And here is the part nobody talks about. Each cycle makes the next one harder to break. Not slightly harder. Significantly harder. Because the variable reinforcement schedule is accumulating. The conditioning is deepening with every repetition. The trap is learning your weight. The neuroscience behind why this is so difficult to escape begins with a finding from Wolfram Schultz and colleagues in the 1990s that changed how researchers understand motivation entirely. Schultz was studying dopamine neurons in primates and found that dopamine does not fire most intensely when reward arrives. It fires most intensely in the moment before reward arrives, when reward is possible but not yet confirmed. The anticipatory gap. The uncertain window. And this is not a small distinction. It is the entire explanation for compulsive behavior. Your brain is not wired to pursue reward. Your brain is wired to pursue the possibility of reward. And the most powerful possibility is one that has been confirmed before, at unpredictable intervals. This is why the 3 days of silence are, neurologically speaking, more activating than 3 days of warmth. During the silence, your dopamine system is running at full intensity. Scanning for signal. The possibility of the reward is present, and the uncertainty of when it arrives is doing exactly what Skinner's variable schedule was designed to do. It is making the pursuit more compulsive with every cycle. And the moment the warmth returns, the activation is amplified by the deprivation that preceded it. The high is higher because the low was lower. Wait. Let that sit for a moment. The pain of the withdrawal is not a side effect of this dynamic. It is a feature. The low is part of the design. Because the low is what makes the high feel irreplaceable. There is a second neurochemical layer beneath the dopamine system that most discussions of intermittent reinforcement skip entirely. And once you understand it, you will understand why these relationships are so much harder to leave than ordinary bad ones. During the cold phases, cortisol elevates. The body is in a sustained low-level threat state. Chronic cortisol exposure, the kind that comes from weeks or months of relational uncertainty, physically changes the brain. It reduces volume in the hippocampus, the region responsible for contextual memory and rational evaluation. It increases reactivity in the amygdala, the threat detection center. The longer you are in the dynamic, the less capable your brain becomes of accurately assessing whether the relationship is good for you. The rational faculty that would normally provide a check on the situation is being degraded by the situation itself. And there is a further mechanism that is almost uniquely cruel. Stress hormones experienced in the consistent presence of a specific person create a physiological bond between that person and the relief of their presence. The person who causes the cortisol spike also, when present, resolves the uncertainty that produced it. The nervous system cannot reliably distinguish between the source of the wound and the source of the comfort when they are the same person. And so it logs both as attachment. The source of the pain becomes the thing you reach for when the pain gets too much. This is the biochemistry of why abuse survivors often describe their abuser as the only one who could make them feel safe. Now here is the part that tends to make people either relieved or angry depending on their own history with this dynamic. Not everyone who delivers intermittent reinforcement is doing so deliberately. Many people who create this pattern in relationships do so because it is the pattern they were trained in. Their own attachment experience was inconsistent. Their own emotional regulation is poor. The inconsistency is not a tactic. It is a symptom. And the attachment it creates in the other person is collateral damage, not a goal. But some people do use this mechanism deliberately. Research on dark triad personality traits, specifically the combination of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, consistently identifies elevated capacity for strategic deployment of exactly this dynamic. The deliberate love bomber calibrates the initial dose to create maximum dependency. The subsequent withdrawal is a measurement device, a test of how hard the target will work to restore the connection, how much they will reorganize their life around the pursuit of this person's approval. Each successful cycle deepens the conditioning, and the person running the schedule experiences something very close to control. Because they have it. The manipulator is Skinner. The target is the animal in the box. And the relationship is the experimental chamber where only one of the two people gets to set the schedule. You need to understand this because the experience is identical from the inside whether the schedule is deliberate or not. The damage is the same. The exit is the same. But the explanation for why it happened is not. One of the most documented and most undervalued findings in this research is that intelligence provides almost no protection against this dynamic. This is not a failure mode specific to people who are unusually trusting or unusually damaged by their history. It is a failure mode of the dopamine system. And the dopamine system does not take instruction from the prefrontal cortex once it has been conditioned. By the time the analytical mind is forming opinions about the relationship, the conditioning is already in place. The attachment is biochemical before it is cognitive. And the analytical mind, which is generating the story of the relationship, is doing so from inside the conditioned system. It is not a neutral observer. It is shaped by the same variable reinforcement as everything else. This is documented. People who are trained therapists, who know the clinical literature on trauma bonding, who can explain intermittent reinforcement to you in precise theoretical detail, can be caught in this dynamic and genuinely unable to exit it through insight alone. Knowing the name of the trap does not open it. The exit requires something more than understanding the mechanism. It requires complete removal of the variable schedule. Not reduction. Not distance. Removal. Because the nervous system, trained by Skinner's schedule, will keep pressing the lever through any duration of non-reward if the schedule has historically produced pellets. Hope is the sustaining mechanism of the addiction. And as long as the variable source is present in any form, hope persists. Patrick Carnes, in his 1997 work on trauma bonding, identified the 4 conditions that reliably produce a bond that the person experiencing it cannot distinguish from love. A perceived threat to well-being. Intermittent positive reinforcement. Isolation from outside perspectives. And a felt sense of being unable to leave. These conditions do not require extreme circumstances. The cycle of warmth and coldness alone, the simple alternation of closeness and withdrawal on a variable schedule, is sufficient to produce an attachment of this kind and intensity. And this is the most disorienting thing about it. It does not feel like trauma. It feels like the most profound and necessary connection the person has ever experienced. The highs reach levels that stable relationships never produce. The relief of reunion after a period of coldness is experienced by the nervous system as coming home. And the brain, which has no reliable mechanism for distinguishing the biochemistry of genuine secure attachment from the biochemistry of a trauma bond at the level of felt experience, files both under love. This is why people in these situations are not confused about their own experience. They are reporting their experience accurately. The feeling is real. The need is real. The intensity is real. What is wrong is not their perception of the experience. What is wrong is what their nervous system has been taught to call love, and what it was actually taught by, and who did the teaching. Those are the 3 questions that the rest of this video answers. Leaving an intermittent reinforcement dynamic is a withdrawal, not a decision. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in managing this situation. The person who exits will experience intrusive thought centered on the absent person. Intense physical craving for contact. Disrupted sleep and appetite. And most significantly, a progressive idealization of the person they left that intensifies with absence rather than diminishing. The brain, conditioned to value the source of variable reward at an inflated level, does not recalibrate when the source is removed. It escalates. The absent person becomes more precious in memory than they ever were in presence. This is the mechanism behind the experience that people describe when they say they cannot stop thinking about someone who treated them badly. They are not confused about the quality of the relationship. They are experiencing withdrawal symptoms. The advice commonly given in this situation, to just move on, to recognize it for what it was, to decide to stop wanting this person, is advice that fundamentally misunderstands what has occurred neurologically. Recovery from this follows the same arc as recovery from conditioned chemical dependence. It requires time. It requires complete removal of the variable reward source. And it is physiological as much as it is psychological. The body is in recovery, not just the mind. The good news, and there is good news, is that the extinction curve is real. The pressing stops. The nervous system returns to baseline. It takes longer than people expect. But it is not permanent. The actual evidence-based path out of a trauma bond begins with one structural change. Complete removal of exposure to the variable reward source. This is called no contact, and it is not an emotional gesture. It is a pharmacological intervention. The drug is the relationship, and the treatment is the removal of the drug. The nervous system cannot complete the extinction curve while intermittent reinforcement is still being delivered in any form. Even occasional contact, even checking their social media, even receiving second-hand information through mutual connections, constitutes a partial dose. And a partial dose, as Skinner's extinction research demonstrated, is more effective at sustaining conditioned behavior than no dose at all. Hope is the active ingredient. The knowledge that the reward might return is sufficient to keep the lever being pressed. The therapeutic work in this recovery is not primarily about understanding the other person or their motivations. It is about the sustained experience of time passing without the variable reward. It is about the nervous system being allowed to complete the extinction curve without interruption. And it is about something that takes longer but matters more than any of the acute recovery work. It is about rebuilding the baseline, the reference point for what connection feels like, so that warmth without anxiety stops feeling flat and starts feeling like what it actually is. Safe. And safe, eventually, starts to feel like something worth staying for. Not because the stakes are high, because the ground is stable. The broader truth that intermittent reinforcement points toward is one of the most important and most uncomfortable findings in the psychology of human attachment. We believe that the intensity of what we feel is a reliable guide to its worth. We believe that love is validated by its power, its necessity, its irreplaceability. And sometimes that is true. But the research, from Skinner's rats to Carnes' trauma bonding to Schultz's dopamine neurons, tells a different story. The most intense feelings of attachment and need can be produced entirely artificially. Through a pattern. Through the precise calibration of reward and deprivation against a nervous system that evolved to form bonds and does not have a reliable defense against having that tendency weaponized. The slot machine is not worth the feeling it produces in you. The pull is real. The activation is real. The need is real. But the object that produced the need is not, and never was, the thing the need was about. It was about the schedule. And the schedule can be dismantled once you understand that you were not weak for being caught in it. You were human. And your brain was doing exactly what it was built to do. This has been the Echo Principle. We map the unseen blueprints of human behavior. The most powerful feelings are not always about the person who produced them. Sometimes they are about the pattern. And the pattern was never really about you at all. We will see you in the next one.